How will we tell the story of this time? How will we tell the story of our role in this particular slice of history? How will we let others know what happened in this early weeks of the second administration of the dictator? Each of us will have a narrative of this time. Some will be blessed to be able to share that narrative with the next generation, or the one after that, or perhaps even the one after that. I often wonder what became of the stories of those who survived other dictators in other parts of the world. Those who survived Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Those who survived Noriega, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, the Marcos. Those who survived Idi Amin, Castro, Ortega, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, the Shah, the Second Spring, and those who survived bin Laden. We know some of the stories from those eras, but we know that most of them have been lost to time, and like the survivors themselves, intentionally reduced, denied, dismissed, quieted, erased. We know about the camps in Germany because there were thousands who survived, even as millions were executed. Who will tell the stories of those who survived Putin? Viktor Orban, Donald Trump. The World Population Review reports that 66 of the world's 195 countries are currently ruled by dictatorial regimes. 66 out of 195 is about a third. Now, we know what life was like for those imprisoned in the death camps of Germany because a number of folks who survived were able to describe their experiences there. Many, many more were never able to tell those stories. Viktor Frankl, of course, was one of the most famous of the camp survivors. He was a trained doctor when he was rounded up, and his education kept him alive because he was useful. But what about those who just survived? What about those who didn't survive? We know the one story of Anne Frank, who stayed hidden in an attic with her family for years, hoping for the war to end before being discovered and sent to Auschwitz to die, like millions of others. Those are the two most familiar narratives of those years. The diary of a young girl who did not live beyond her teens, and the reflections of a physician and psychologist who survived unspeakable horror. I do not have to tell you that the really scary stuff is already beginning, right? That's not news. Immigration officers raided a school in Chicago this week. A dozen inspector generals at the U.S. Justice Department were fired late Friday night. And our nascent dictator shut down federal offices that supported diversity, equity, and inclusion across U.S. government services. The state of Idaho, just for fun, has asked the Supreme Court to reconsider and reverse its ruling on same-sex marriage. An amendment was introduced in Congress this week that as proposed, would allow presidents, particularly one, to serve more than 2 terms. The president's cabinet is being filled with sycophants and brown-nosers, people utterly without any integrity of their own, who are willing, eager even, to carry out cruelty on behalf of this guy. The one with the spray tan who wants to be king. How on earth will we tell the story of this time? Who among us can even think long enough to put together a damn grocery list, never mind chronicle the downfall of an empire? Now, who tells this story makes a big difference, of course. Our opening words by Phyllis Wheatley were written by a woman who at 7 years old was sold in a marketplace in Boston, dressed only in a strip of tattered carpet. She was named Phyllis by her new owners because that was the name of the boat that she came on. No one knew or cared what her first name was. Wheatley was the name of her owners, the people who purchased this child. She had to get her work published in England because American publishers would not print the words of a black woman. Typically, history of conflict is written by those who win. But what are we doing now? Who are the scribes of our time? Amanda Gorman, certainly. So many others. Whose words are likely to survive the necessary years or decades to come to light when the dust finally settles from whatever this mad experiment is? We have so many really smart people who are reporting on the daily events in our world, but the pace of the 24/7 news media prevents any kind of comprehensive examination and interpretation of the history as it evolves before our eyes. Reporting by corporate media in the U.S. is generally a lot like some places on our Susquehanna River, a mile wide and a half-inch deep. Journalists are just so busy trying to keep up with the fire hose of information that they simply do not have the time to dig deep. This is also a result of the emerging oligarchy of our nation. A handful of stinkingly wealthy, all right, I won't use that next word, are pulling the puppet strings to run government for their own benefit. They've also bought media companies. Local newspapers and television stations have been gobbled up by larger corporations who cut costs to maximize profits. Local reporters who once covered local news are mostly gone. No longer are there regular stories about the antics of school boards, planning committees, town councils, and county commissioners. When I was a young reporter, my bread and butter was made with those regular items. I knew the players and their agendas. I knew what policies they favored and what they opposed. And whenever they did something spectacularly ridiculous, I wrote it up and my editors slapped it on page 1. Because back then the local press covered the local news. And people wanted to know what was happening in the schools, in their police departments, and in City Hall. But here we are, with a zillion tons of information available in our phones, but we have no analysis, no long view interpretation, no context for what is happening. It feels like we are in the spin cycle of a load of laundry and moving so fast that we are mashed together, paralyzed and unable to connect. We are flooded with information, but starved for wisdom. I remember what happened 8 years ago right? After the 2016 election, after the inauguration, many of us rallied behind the indivisible movement, wore silly hats and marched on Washington. It caused an uncomfortable amount of pressure on some of our elected officials. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. I think what is problematic now is like what was probably problematic during the civil rights era, and in Germany, in Cuba, USSR, China, all the rest. Those of us in the opposition have been cursed with internal moral compasses. We know what is right and what is wrong, and we care, even a little bit, about what others or history might think of us. We have the capacity for shame. And we are faced with a real block when it comes to imagining human beings who are incapable of shame. Our happy little normal brains cannot wrap around the notion of not caring, which is a blessing and a curse. These are people who may know right from wrong, but simply don't care. They don't care whom they hurt. They're people who are unashamed when they are called out in public on a big screen. That's what I said then. This is now. This is what I say now. That's not a change in principles or a change in values or a change even in philosophy. What that is the revelation that there are some folks who are incapable of empathy and who put their own comfort and needs ahead of what is right, of what is kind, what is just. Empathy, we used to say, is what separates us from most of the rest of the animals on this planet. That's being disproven one animal at a time, actually. But empathy is how we, within ourselves, imagine how another person feels in a situation. We can feel it, see it, know it, smell it, act on it. We would not want for others something that we do not want for ourselves. So how aware are we of the time we are in? I came across a TikTok video this week, outside of that half hour when it was gone. It's by a creator called Hannah the Writer. And in this video, she describes her grandmother's experience as a little girl in Vienna in World War II. She was a little girl. She was largely unaware of big things like war and stuff until she saw an armed motorcade drive down her street. Then it became real. And for that little girl, that's when World War II started for her, right? Hannah, the writer, describes this delicious thing called, it's a writer's principle that says that your characters cannot know the nature or the genre of the book or movie that they are in. The guy in the horror movie who goes down to the basement to check a noise, but is not worried because he doesn't know he's in a horror movie. He's just a guy that heard a thump downstairs, and so he goes. If he knew he was in a horror movie, he'd just leave. Right? Well, some will. So your character cannot know where they are in the trajectory of the story either. Right? We cannot know whether we are coming in at the preview, the beginning, the middle, the end, the postlude, the final little bitty credits at the end after the best guy and all that stuff. We're just trying to get through until the next page or the next chapter. The situation began when we became aware of it. And it can be frustrating for those of us who have studied history to encounter people now who say, "What happened? Where did all of this come from?" I'm hearing some chuckles. There are some of us who have been gritting our teeth saying, "We've been warning you for years." So this woman, for her grandmother, that's when the war started, when she saw the motorcade in Venice. Now that certainly was not the beginning of the war, but the little girl did not know that. That's when the war began for her. At this point, she may have understood that the genre of her own movie at that time was a war movie, but she could not know where in the movie her part began. Was she arriving in the middle of the movie, the beginning, the end, or down in those minor credits where it says "face in a window"? Now, the story she tells her grandchildren is limited by her own experience in that time, just as we are limited by our understanding of our time. Is this the beginning, the middle, the end of something national, something global? We can see ourselves now in the genre that says late-stage capitalism with fascism rising, right? But where are we in the story arc? I dare say that we are still in the early to middle years. The camps have not yet been built, but they will. The atrocities have begun slowly, but we believe them to be the actions of a few bad apples. And after all, the atrocities affect other people, right? So it's easy for us to look away. Who will tell the story of these years? How will those stories be recorded, and how will they be remembered? Will one story be presented by the victors while another lies hidden in a dusty attic where people hid from those who would do them harm? Ursula Le Guin, at one point, accepted a fancy pants literary award for lifetime achievement, which is a nice way for literary institutions to acknowledge that they've ignored you for a very long time, but now you're old and they'd like to give you something before you die. Right? Am I wrong? Okay, right? So she was getting this award, lifetime achievement, blah, blah, blah. And she said in her speech, "I rejoice in accepting this award for and sharing it with all the writers who've been excluded from literature for so long, my fellow authors of fantasy and science fiction, writers of the imagination, who for 50 years have watched the beautiful rewards go to the so-called realists. Hard times are coming," she says, "when we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, who can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality." Ursula Le Guin. That award ceremony was in 2014. Hard times are coming, indeed. Stories of fact and fiction will be written about these years. Some will tell of brave resistance, Others will describe unruly agitators. Both will be describing us. Us, or at least my hope for us, it would break my heart if we never made enough noise, enough resistance, enough good trouble to get a mention in the history books. I'd love it if we are the ones who win this thing in the long run, but that's not a guarantee. Political scientists will sometimes say that fascism always falls. I don't know if that's exactly true. What I do know is that a third of the nations in our world are run as dictatorships, where civil liberties do not exist and where the broad spectrum of human expression and experience is oppressed with strangling power. We have the power to direct our own end of this play, of course. We are the ones who are in control of our own narrative in this moment. We have our words still. We can use them still. We are obligated to use them. So what will we do with our words? What will we do with the power of our own narrative? What story will we tell? What will be remembered as truth 100 years from now? That's up to us. We know that we are whole, holy, loved, and powerful. We know that love always wins out over hate, eventually. How long that victory might take is still under consideration. It will depend on our ability to resist, to fight back, to dismantle the systems being constructed right now to target and oppress the most vulnerable among us. In the 1930s, that was Jews. Today, it is LGBTQ folks. In the 1930s, it was Jews and gay men and sex workers and Catholics and Jehovah's Witnesses and lesbians and black people, the Roma, the disabled, political dissidents, and Poles. They all had different colored triangles that they were forced to wear. Today, it is LGBTQ folks, immigrants, and people with brown or black skin whose first language may not be English. Victory and justice will only come when we are willing to say no. No, you will not do that to my neighbor. You will not do that to my friend, my family, my school, my kids, my whatever. You will not do that to us. Fascists are bullies, and like bullies, they are inherently insecure. So they always pick the easy targets, the ones that can't fight back, the ones who don't have popular champions to defend them, the ones that lots of people would kind of like to avoid or maybe have removed to some place where they can't be seen. After the easy targets are gone, then they look around for the next easiest targets. The disabled, perhaps, the addicted, the unhoused, the mentally ill, the freaks and geeks and social outcasts who will not conform. Perhaps radical students or professors or politicians like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, journalists like Rachel Maddow, Joy Reid, Nicole Wallace, who keep insisting on shining a light on all of these terrible behaviors. Then they come for the next most vulnerable. You know how this goes. We all do. We've seen this movie before. We just have had the dubious illusion, comfort of believing that it would never happen here. We were different. We're based on freedom and individual rights. The melting pot. Remember the melting pot we heard about? Well, that comfort or illusion is gone. We know that now. We're not that different from anywhere else because it is happening here. And it will continue to happen here unless we do something to stop it. Now, you've noticed, or maybe you didn't, that my language has changed from I to we, because that is how we're going to make this work. None of us can do it alone. Stopping this nightmare depends on how much we are willing to tolerate. How much will we tolerate for our neighbors and friends? How much will we tolerate for the homeless guy who lives between the railroad tracks and the park? How much will we tolerate for others? Until it becomes how much will we tolerate for ourselves? Will we tolerate evil done to others for so long that our capacity for resistance is exhausted and we are unable to fight back? God, I hope not. And the key, as ever, is relationship. It is connection. It is community. It is interdependence. It is only through that interdependence and relationship that we will succeed. The post-war myth of individualism has nearly kneecapped us. We've forgotten how to rely on each other. We've forgotten how to live in neighborhoods, right? We live in cul-de-sacs now. Am I wrong? Right? I don't know the names of the people who live next door to me. Some of them. Some of them I do, but some of them I don't. Because we are taught that we are individuals. And the old wisdom goes, united we stand, divided we fall. Individually, we are easy to pick off. Together, we can get stuff done. We need to reach out, to connect, to build bridges, build relationships. And I know this is hard stuff. None of us wants to hear this today, right? None of us wants to hear this stuff. It gets old. And the overwhelm is the strategy. The overwhelm is intentional. That's the fire hose thing, so that you just finally just put your head down and say, I can't stand anymore. I'm not going to look. I'm not going to think. And you're bent over and curled up in a ball when it rolls over you. You know? But we who are in this room cannot look away. In very general terms, we have a lot of privilege. Whether it's real or assumed, we have a fair amount of privilege. And because of that, we cannot look away, even though with that privilege, it would be more comfortable to look away. Not happening to me. I'm okay, right? But we can't, because somebody, somewhere, someday will write the story of these years. And that writer can be us and those we help survive, or it can be the other folks. The choice is ours. We are strong. We are smart. together we can make big things happen. Let us not miss our moment to do something that could save the world. Amen.